This is a character profile of Donald, aka Pee-wee Gaskins, author of Final Truth, the Autobiography of a Serial Killer, transcribed by Earle. Just a heads up, mature content warning advised, and run length is approximately 20 minutes. I am one of the few that truly understands what death and pain are all about. I've walked the same path as God. By taking lives and making others afraid of me, I become God's equal. Through killing others, I become my own master. Through my own power, I come to my own redemption. Donald Pee-wee Gaskins. Now, Donald Pee-wee Gaskins lived a complex life of trauma and cruelty, which was eventually and quickly reflected in how he treated others. He was always smaller than his peers, only ever growing to be about 5'4", 5'5", and 130 pounds. This resulted in his peers cruelly nicknaming him Pee-wee. He didn't take to this nickname at first, but eventually grew into it. He admitted he's always been fascinated about the way things worked and spent most of his life, when not killing, working on all things mechanical. He actually had his first job in his preteens working at a mechanic shop, utilizing his natural-born gift for cars. After his teens and early 20s, he bounced around in and out of reform school and a few prison stints. Gaskins mostly moved around the South Carolina cities of Prospect, Sumter, and Charleston, usually as a cover for killing, and at times elsewhere along the East Coast, but was always able to find some kind of work, either legal or illegal. He would strip cars, rebuild them, and send them out of state to sell, would burn down barns for insurance payouts, was involved in arms trading by turning semi-automatics into automatics, as well as working as something called a roustabout, which meant completing the setup and takedown process of carnivals. He married 6 times, usually because of beauty and mainly sex, but ended up having 2 kids, a daughter and a son, with 2 of these wives almost 2 decades apart. Ever since he could remember, Pee-wee was involved in those illegal activities. He didn't really have an aptitude for working remedial jobs and always described himself as having this quote-unquote bothersomeness in him. When he did start killing for sport or in his mind out of necessity, he had already caused great bodily harm and had been actively raping boys and girls since he was about 12 years old. Even when he killed, he was always observing and curious about the way his victims reacted to what he did to them. Once again, this curiosity resulted in him being very creative, using methods like drowning, burning, using a ball-peen hammer, water pump beretta, strangulation, bleeding out, and his favorite, the Arkansas toothpick, not to mention a little bit of cannibalism here and there. Eventually, Pee-wee was caught for these horrendous crimes and was sentenced with the death penalty, twice, after killing another man in prison. With nothing left to lose, Pee-wee decided to tell his own version of events, as he calls it, his final truth. He's able to do so by telling his story to a man named Earle, whom he felt very comfortable with. Wilton recorded over the course of 15 months Pee-wee's entire life story. Earle's only involvement in this was his acting as a transcriber. Now, as Final Truth is an account of Pee-wee's life, we get to see the world through his eyes in a creepy yet still interesting way. He's a very complex person. One could almost describe him as a round version of a character. He does also act as the protagonist and antagonist as a result of his actions. His memoir raises the question of what type of character archetype does he really portray, static or dynamic? Maybe he's the exception and actually fits both. His first memory is being at a carnival and watching a king cobra eat a rat, an animal that did this not out of necessity to eat, but purely to kill, and as a result, Pee-wee gets his first sexual arousal from this, and one of the last things Pee-wee did was kill a man while on death row, in solitary confinement, and max. As both events are deemed morally wrong, he plays the role, again, as an antagonist, and these antagonists are usually considered static characters. He, however, faces events in his life that lead to an escalation of behaviors, but does escalation based on a course of life events determine if someone fulfills a dynamic role? Perhaps Pee-wee may be the exception and succeed in both characteristics models. Just as he does, being an antagonist and a protagonist, Pee-wee may in fact be both, a static character creating the primary role and a dynamic sort as a secondary. This argument leaves great room for much discussion. What would you decide? As I had mentioned, Pee-wee is a perplexing human, and being that, though both sinister and horrifying, it's still important to understand whether or not his final truth is actually true. Of course, Gaskins mostly wrote this book for himself to paint a clear picture of his life story. He also wrote it because he wanted to be remembered as one of the greatest killers in history. He did think he had an epic story and most likely exacerbated his version of events, but we'll try to give our narrator the benefit of the doubt. There also may have been a chance he was receiving money under the table to do this. Because Final Truth is one of the rare books actually written firsthand by a serial killer, there's a huge audience for true crime aficionados. Pee-wee's autobiography is somewhat of a novelty item, running an average of about $80, depending on what condition the copy is in. It's also an important piece for the fields of criminology and psychology to observe and identify warning signs and find ways to take preventable actions. One MD, Thomas J. Andrews, remarked, "It is a remarkable book that enables the reader to understand the thoughts and emotions of a man who killed from a psychopathic need to identify with his victims through the joining of his own pain with theirs." Pee-wee was born in March of 1933 in Leo, South Carolina, a little town nearby the city of Prospect. He grew up on a tobacco farm and has little recollection of his childhood, but notes from the very beginning he knew he had these urges in him to do bad things. This wasn't helped much with a mother who left him alone, often and for extended periods of time, whilst entertaining, as Pee-wee calls them, his stepdaddies. It's never directly stated if she was a sex worker or not, as he still cared for her and probably didn't want to speak too negatively of her. Now, everyone else in his life was pretty abusive due to his small stature and treated him as a bit of a punching bag. Despite all this, Gaskins still makes a point of, quote, "Don't get me wrong, my childhood weren't all that bad all the time. I certainly weren't in no way what you could ever call abused. Final truth is, for the most part, my family life was pretty good."
One who the older ones picked on, and I was kicked around all the time too. And made at nights they would make me take a big old wooden foot tub, fill it with water, and I had to wash everybody's feet thoroughly. And if I did anything that any of my uncles or aunts didn't like, they would take a hedge bush switch or a pear tree sprout or an apple tree sprout. As long as it was a good switch, and they'd tear my back and legs up. There'd be red stripes all over my body and legs. And if my sister told them I had done anything, no matter if I had or I had not.
Without too many positive parental figures or role models in his life, Pee-wee was off to a troubled start, dropping out of school around 11 or 12 years old. He grew up in an unstable period of America with the Great Depression and headed into World War II, so he took up comfort with some of the other neighborhood incendiaries, Danny and Marsh. They called themselves the Trouble Trio, breaking and entering and hanging around honky-tonks, which could loosely be described as bars/brothels. The peak of their mischief culminated in the three of them raping Marsh's 13-year-old sister by tricking her into coming to their hangout they called the Hideout. Marsh and Danny soon left town after this. After his good old buddies left, Pee-wee kept on breaking and entering to steal and turn a profit. At one point, a girl caught him and came at him with a hatchet. Gaskins managed to take the hatchet from her and nearly killed her. He was shortly caught thereafter and was sent to spend the next 5 years in reformatory school. He tried to escape at least 4 times, as it was a terrible place that revolved around a system of the boys brutally raping one another. They called this the Pecker Order. During his last escape, Pee-wee met Mary, his first wife, and agreed to finish his last 3 months so he could marry her. She shortly became pregnant with Shelby Gaskins, Pee-wee's only daughter. Pee-wee shortly ended up in the South Carolina Penitentiary in Columbia after getting out of reformatory school. He got caught for splitting another girl's head open with a hammer after she told him people were talking about his barn-burning insurance collection scheme. Luckily, she lived, but it got him sentenced to 5 years in prison. It was basically a repeat of reform school, but the Pecker Order was now based around power men. To become one of these power men and gain respect, he killed the biggest, baddest man there, Hazel Brazel. Prison then got much better for him. But after Mary divorced him in 1955, he decided to escape once again. He was sent back after accidentally getting caught for helping a girl he kind of had a crush on, to break out her quote-unquote brother from jail. He was then released again in 1961. And because 10 years in and out of prison was good enough in the law's eyes for Pee-wee to definitely learn his lesson, well, then of course he went back to doing the same things and got busted for raping a 12-year-old girl. He escaped the courthouse after being arrested by jumping out of the top floor window. He then started traveling along with a reverend who was preaching sermons along the East Coast. He used this opportunity as a cover to steal. He was then sent back to prison when a Lumbee girl he had married turned him in when Pee-wee had told her about how he had raped the 12-year-old girl. He was then paroled in 1968. This was a very big mistake. The bad feelings, or so-called bothersomeness, Pee-wee had always spoken about was acted upon for the first time in 1969. He divided his kills into two types of categories. Serious murders were people he killed who were close to him and usually committed out of what he deemed necessity, so he wouldn't go back to jail. Only 15 of these were ever confirmed, starting with his niece Janice Kirby in 1970. The other category were his coastal kills. None of these kills were ever confirmed, but he claimed to have killed around 80 to 90 victims, averaging about one every 6 weeks, and Pee-wee described them as his pleasure kills. He would go along the East Coast, finding victims, usually hitchhikers, then rape and murder them. He said, quote, "To me, they was victims without names, buried in graves without markers," end quote. Of course, Gaskins' victims are all significant, and if his claimed kill count is actually true, which, given the time period of untracked missing people and runaways, very well could be, all of these victims are of value. There are a few murders that are worth distinguishing as a testament to Pee-wee's character. Doreen Dempsey and Robin Michelle Dempsey were killed in Pee-wee's final truth because he couldn't stop himself from raping a 2-year-old. To keep this secret, and probably to keep himself from being beaten to death in prison, he claimed to have killed Doreen for having babies with black men, and that he killed Robin because she was a mixed child. Realistically, Gaskins is not a racist and had no problem with people of color. The other one to speak of is Peggy Cuttantino. She's notable because it's one of Gaskins' accounts to prove this is indeed his final truth. The law claimed they had caught the guy who killed her, so when Pee-wee confessed in 1977, they disregarded his statements. But he did know details that were sealed in the autopsy report, disturbing ones, like the fact she was covered in these strange cigarette-like burns, but Pee-wee admitted they were from him sprinkling acid on her. The year 1975 was sort of a culmination for Pee-wee. He went on a bit of a spree with his serious murders, and bodies started piling up. He got involved in a hired hit at one point, and too many people started knowing about what was going on and that there was something a little bit more to Pee-wee Gaskins. He pulled in a friend, Walter Neely, which broke his rule to not involve anyone. Walter Neely cracked under pressure from the law when they started asking questions about evidence that tied Pee-wee to one of his victims, Kim Gelkins. Neely then led police to Gaskins' personal cemetery, where they found 8 bodies to cut a deal. Pee-wee and Walter Neely were arrested at the end of 1975 and convicted in May of 1976. At this point, Walter Neely had the defense of mental illness and got away with 1 life sentence, whereas Pee-wee received the death penalty. Pee-wee then made a series of plea deals to get additional life sentences and put off the electric chair. Pee-wee claimed, "Far as I was concerned, I deserved to be the most famous inmate in CCI and the most famous criminal in the state," and the men inside, as well as the people outside, agreed. After ending up with 9 life sentences, Pee-wee did something that resulted in him finally getting the death penalty. For real, this time. A man named Tony Simo had heard about Pee-wee and hired him for $2,000 to kill a man named Rudolph Tyner that Pee-wee was in maximum security with. Tyner had killed Tony Simo's parents and was in the appeals process to drop the death penalty. Gaskins accepted Simo's challenge, mostly because he wanted to prove he could. He was a bit of an egotist, as most serial killers are, and the money didn't hurt either. He tried multiple times to poison Tyner, and after all else failed, he had Simo send him C4 in the heel of a shoe, where he then used his mechanic skills to rig a radio with the C4 inside. While in solitary confinement, he managed to sneak the radio into Tyner's cell with his consent, claiming they could talk through it. When he plugged the wire the radio was connected to into an outlet, the radio exploded, killing Tyner. Pee-wee was then reasonably resentenced to the chair, as prison walls proved to be no match for him.
But just make sure you know that looks at it ain't been tampered with up and bad, and get it up to him, and then if I don't give it to him, and we'll put him in, but I'll furnish a radio that's already in him. Okay. I'll get one of these battery electric types up in one of these old cheap things, and put it in and give it to him, and when he plugs that son of a bitch up, it'll blow him on into hell. Okay. That's about the best way that I can figure to get him, because everything we get him just looks like it makes him sick as hell, and that's it.
Pee-wee realized his luck was up by this point and figured he had nothing else to lose. In his final years, he worked heavily with Wilton Earle to write his autobiography by recording a series of audio tapes that was transcribed into Gaskins' final truth. He said, "In this book, I'm not asking nobody's forgiveness. I got no apologies to make for my life. I always had my reasons for everything I ever done." He was labeled the meanest man in America after the way he killed Rudolph Tyner, and even still, he claimed he wasn't as famous as he believed he deserved to be. He was executed on September 6th, 1991. Because Wilton Earle was fundamental in publishing this book, his motives are worth evaluating as well. He mostly had good intentions, saying, "I wanted to write his perception with his life. It was truly his story, nothing in there from me except probably, as it turned out, a one-page preface and 6 pages of notes at the end. The rest of the words are Gaskins." Earle himself is a hard guy to find information on. He's been published many times, but for the most part only under pen names. In publishing Final Truth, Wilton Earle may have seen some kind of claim to fame. Wilton Earle's final notes do go out with the observation, "Until we finally understand them, we are faced with a certain knowledge that no one anywhere, not even in the security of a death row solitary cell, is safe from the special kind of mind of a Pee-wee Gaskins, a Ted Bundy, a John Wayne Gacy, or even a Jeffrey Dahmer, or one of the thousands of others like them who live among us, but whom we never recognize until too late."